People who work in morgues or with the dead, what is the creepiest thing you've witnessed? Human osteologist here. I work with dry human bones, so they don't do too much. But one of the times I've ever gotten the creeps was when I was handling a crania in the collection and could hear the wisdom teeth shaking around, partially formed but not quite erupted, in the mandible. Wisdom teeth form around 18 years old and erupt generally in late teens or early 20s. I, at the time, was about 20 and my wisdom teeth were just coming through. I realized these remains belonged to a girl about my age. That's probably exactly what my skull looks like. It really humanized things for me. I got punched in the balls by a dead guy. I used to work hospital security. Part of our job was to help with 10 to 80 assists, movement of bodies to and out of the morgue. I was on a call to move one and the body's limbs were sticking out at odd stiff angles. I attempted to move the corpse's arms into a better spot to shimmy the bag into the body fridge. His arm stayed in place for a moment, but when I released my grip, smack. All buddy hit me right in the sack. Attended a suspected fire once where we could smell smoke but couldn't locate the fire. Eventually located it, and when we entered the house there was an old woman slumped over on the floor. Tried to turn her over but couldn't. Turned out that she had been laid on one of the old bar-type heaters, and because the heat was not allowed to escape, it had burned a hole through the floorboards and the heater fell through the hole. However, when she was laid on it, her body fat started to melt and run into the floorboards. Then when the heater fell through, she cooled. By the time we got there, she was one with the floor. Two of us to get shovels under her to roll her over. It was years before I could eat smoky bacon flavor crisps again. I initiated compressions on my patient when she unexpectedly coded. About halfway through my first round, the patient pinked up, eyes opened, turned her head and groaned. I stopped, and so did she. Turned gray and unresponsive, so I started compressions again. She woke up again, and I realized that compressions were providing adequate perfusion to her brain, so she'd wake up, but her heart wasn't doing anything. I had to continue compressions and shock my patient, who was awake, groaning, and alert enough to know what was happening. I've coded countless patients without a problem, but this event gave me nightmares for some time. You have smelt nothing until you have smelt the farts of the dead. Former set. I used to be a med lab tech, 68K, in the Army and sometimes assist with autopsies in the hospital. We did one on an infantryman, Fort Carson, 4th ID, that was a suicide by gunshot to the right temple. The round passed under his frontal lobe and just behind his eyes, so it barely skimmed his brain. The pathologist estimated that it took several minutes for him to die just because the location merely made him bleed out and wasn't instant. The creepy thing was, because the round passed just behind his eyes and wasn't hollow point or anything that spread out, it snipped the back of his eyes, causing them to drain, so his eyes were kind of deflated looking, on top of being very glossy, as a dead person's eyes are. It was weird and sad. My buddy worked at a crematorium, and after burning the bodies they would have to rake out the stuff that doesn't burn, like hip replacements, stuff like that. I can't for the life of me remember what they did. Gold fillings, removed before or after. Pacemakers were removed before burning, I'm pretty sure. A lot of this stuff would be recycled for the precious metals. My creepiest moment was when I was in the morgue by myself at 4 a.m. I was using the lift to put a body into a crypt. It had reached roughly eye level when the power went out. It is now pitch dark. I couldn't see my hand in front of my face, then all the fans died, and all I could hear was the crinkling of body bags. That's when I started to hear disembodied voices. I couldn't make out what they were saying or where they were coming from. The power comes back a few moments later on and I move on with my night. Turns out the voices were just the automated "the power has gone out, switching to generator power" message. Haha. A friend told me this story ages ago, and I hope I remember it well enough. When he was 18, he worked for a single plane transport contractor, and one time they had to carry a body. It wasn't autopsied or prepared for funeral yet, that was where they were taking it. So it was wrapped and just sort of laying on the floor. Now, when you're in the air, I'm sure other pilots will tell you, the rise and fall of the airplane will do strange things with gravity, air pressure, and necromancy. In any case, the corpse had enough air in its lungs that the lower pressure outside the body caused the air inside to be expelled, slowly, and through the larynx. Meanwhile, rise and fall of the plane caused the body to sit up and the wrapping to fall away. Sitting up caused it to expel more air from the lungs. So while flying a dead body in the plane, they heard a long low moan, and saw a dead body sit up in the back of the plane. The pilot panicked, left the controls, and ran back and punched the corpse across the face, knocking it back down. He told me about how they figured out what happened, but I was laughing too hard at that point to really pick up the details. I do remember that they had to explain the additional damage to the corpse when they arrived at their destination. Edit, a detail and a spelling. Not a morgue worker, but I watched my father die in the hospital. A bad fall led to unsurvivable brain damage. He was there for about 6 days, only 60 years old. We knew he wanted him on machines, so when the time came to take him off life support, his breathing turned to gargling, after a quick heart attack according to the IC, exactly like the sound of someone hitting a big bong. I couldn't smoke one for a while after the sound kept fucking me up. And right before I left the room I gave him a last kiss on his forehead. It felt like he had worms wriggling around under his skin and his eyebrows started to twitch a little, like he was raising and lowering his brows. He was gone at that point too. No brain activity, no heartbeat, yet his fine muscles were twitching away. I think the nurse said it was the muscles straining from no oxygen. It was disturbing, to say the least. Fucked up enough 2 years later I have to suddenly put my 11-year-old lab down, and the service we were going to do home euthanasia with was somehow booked and couldn't help us, nor could many others. So I had to find some new random vet to take care of it. I'm a mess. My dog was scared, in pain, and in a completely new place, with me a semi-useless sobbing pile. The vet was wonderful and left him with me till I was ready to let him go, and when the tech picked his body up he made the sound he made when I wouldn't give him more treats. All I could do was whimper, "Wait, is he?" And the vet ran him back over to me to show he was gone and it was just air escaping. I hate to be like this, but I dunno which was worse. My best friend growing up lived in the upstairs of his family-owned funeral home. We used to play hide and go seek in the caskets until one day one of the empty caskets wasn't empty because they had just gotten a delivery from a different funeral home. Not the answer you're looking for, but I worked as a gravedigger/cemetery worker throughout college. The only weird thing I experienced was an unexpected pothole over a section of graves. If a casket is buried without a cement vault, eventually the casket can collapse, and it creates a pothole over top of the grave. It's a pain in the ass to deal with from a groundkeeping perspective, and it's a little weird to think of the casket collapsing 6 feet below ground. For that reason, the cemetery where I worked required burials to have a cement vault. It was the older caskets that didn't always have them. In all honesty, I'm not a fan of overdramatizing places like morgues and cemeteries. Death is a natural part of life. The cemetery I worked at was one of the most peaceful places I have visited. We worked hard to make it comfortable and peaceful so that loved ones could feel peace and comfort when they came to visit. I helped with an autopsy where a woman wasn't found for a few weeks and her cats started chewing on her. I am an ER nurse. One time we had someone die and no one came to claim the body, so they went to the morgue and that was it. But their phone stayed behind in the ER by accident. Every day at 2:30 p.m. an alarm would go off. We couldn't turn the alarm off or shut the phone off without a passcode, and the battery on that thing was lasting forever. So we locked it in the med room, but it was still really loud. We had to listen to that dead person's alarm haunt us at the same time every day for a week. To this day, I shudder when I hear the same ringtone. Not human, but we were doing mammalogy lab dissection and my squirrel had ball cancer. I was having a hard time figuring out the sex because are these testicles? Ovaries? This doesn't look like anything in the book. Professor came over and confirmed the squirrel's nuts had a bunch of tumors on them. Sorry for not fitting the prompt exactly, but figured I'd share. Here we go. Back in the day, I used to work for a funeral home, and oftentimes when an elderly client has prearrangements and they pass away, I would be dispatched to collect their earthly remains and bring them back to the funeral home to be prepped for their celebration of life/going away party. This is after there is no suspected foul play. Now sometimes this would be a collection directly from the morgue or from their residence. More often than not, this was typically in the middle of the night. On call 9 p.m. to 6 a.m. Well, one night I was dispatched to collect an elderly gentleman who crossed the Rainbow Bridge and was deemed to be picked up around 1 a.m. By the time I got ready into the residence, it was around 2 a.m. and back to the funeral home around 3 a.m. Once I helped Mr. Doe get comfortable in our cooler, I was ready to leave. As I was just getting ready to set the alarm and head back home, the prep room door behind me flung open, and then slammed very abruptly. This door is very big, very heavy, and takes some power to open and close. Needless to say, I was early for my normal shift in the morning because, well, I didn't go back to sleep. The creepiest thing about it is that just before that happened, the hair rose on the back of my neck. Edited, a typo in formatting.